Leonidas Johnson, the author of the new book, Raising Victims, The Pernicious Rise of Critical Race Theory. It's great to see you again. I'm so glad to have you on the Cain Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me again, Will. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we had such a fascinating conversation almost maybe 2 years ago here on the Cain Podcast prior to video. So it's good to see you in person as we talk. And I've read the book. It's an incredible book. It's an incredible treatise on race in America. Beyond even the invention of critical race theory, it delves into seeing each other as individuals and honestly adopting some faith-filled promises of living with a life of gratitude and perspective. But I want to start with this. I love one of the first analogies you employ, which is the analogy of St. George the Dragon Slayer. Tell me about St. George the Dragon Slayer.
Yeah, St. George the Dragon Slayer is an allegory that was developed by a philosopher named Cain out of Australia. And the idea is that you have this prolific dragon slayer, St. George. He slays all the dragons in the land. The villagers love him. He's prolific. He's a hero. And then all the dragons are gone, and he's finally able to go into retirement. And so he's sitting in his easy chair and enjoying his retirement, but he suddenly has an identity crisis. His entire life, he's been slaying dragons. His entire identity has been rooted in slaying dragons, and suddenly he doesn't have that anymore. And so he doesn't know who he is or what his purpose in life is. So he starts to have that identity crisis, and he looks out the window, and what does he see? A dragon. Amazing. He's saved. His identity is saved. So he runs out and he slays the dragon. And now suddenly he's the hero again. And then all of a sudden there's dragons everywhere. There's dragons that bark. There's dragons that quack. There's dragons who claim to be villagers even. And he slays them all. And eventually he's seen swinging his sword at thin air, proclaiming it to be the fiercest dragon of them all or whatever. It's such an applicable allegory to critical race theory, to progressivism as a whole, because a lot of these people, they have rooted their identity so deeply in slaying the dragon of racism that when the racism isn't there, they have to fabricate it. Because the identity has to surface somehow. They have to find some indication that their purpose is meaningful. And so the only way to do that is to create dragons where they don't exist. And so the rest of us have to pretend like, yes, of course they're dragons. I don't see them, but I'm going to have to trust you because you're the expert. You're St. George. So I think it's a very appropriate allegory for what we're seeing, particularly in, like I said, not just critical race theory, but progressivism as a whole.
There's a lot of characters in this play of modern America's, love affair with racism. In your mind, St. George, the Dragon Slayer, who is St. George in seeing racism behind every corner? I mean, there are activists. There's the role that white guilt plays in this entire drama as well. So in your mind, though, in the perpetuation of the existence of dragons, in the perpetuation of the fight against racism, who is St. George?
Well, it's definitely your race activists. It's the people who perpetuate the ideology itself. What you hear from the founders of critical race theory is that the civil rights movement stalled out. And the reason that critical race theory needed to be developed is because racism was driven underground and it had woven itself into the very fabric of our society. And it needed to be rooted out that way. So now it's this invisible sort of specter, this boogeyman that's operating behind the scenes that only they can see because they have the secret decoder rings to root it out. And so only they can find it and only they can root it out and destroy it. And so it came directly from the founders who had that, the civil rights movement mostly accomplished what it set out to accomplish. And once that happens, when you rooted your identity so deeply in fighting these dragons of racism, then you have to find something else. And Booker T. Washington was very specific about this. He saw that even happening in the beginning of the 1900s, that people were finding that fighting racism or putting these racial problems out in front of the public eye were beneficial for them. And so they didn't have any desire, the way he put it was they didn't want the patient to get well because it was beneficial for them. They found expediency in pushing these issues. And so pick one: Nicole Hannah-Jones, Ibram X. Kendi, Jamel Hill, all the people that are out pushing these racial issues. Everything is racism. Everything that happens, everything that somebody says, everything that somebody does is indicative of white supremacy. It's racism. And then the less common, the less known names, the people that are in these schools and that are pushing it in classrooms, the people that are running training seminars in businesses, everybody that is pushing this ideology is the same because they find that it's beneficial for them to maintain that identity and continue to pretend that these dragons are out there and only they can slay them.
Yeah, in the book, Raising Victims, by the way, you give several names. You talk about, and you mentioned some of them just now, Ibram X. Kendi, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado. Those are some of the founders of critical race theory. Nicole Hannah-Jones, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Robin DiAngelo, Joy Reid at MSNBC, Jamel Hill, formerly of ESPN, Sean King, LeBron James. These are names you're saying that have a vested interest, a professional interest, a personal interest in continuing the idea that America is racist. I want to ask you this, though. You know, when I was on ESPN, Leonidas, one of the things that I often encountered was this. I was given a particular set of circumstances, a particular set of facts of an incident that happened in the United States of America. And I was asked to immediately accept the premise that what occurred was motivated by racism. One of the best examples of this was the quote unquote noose in Bubba Wallace's garage. And if I dared not really even to reject the premise, but to question it or indulge in an analysis of the facts, then I was denying the existence of racism, not just in this particular instance, but in America at large. And then by extension, by the way, when I would have conversations, for example, with some of my black friends at ESPN, I was in essence then denying their personal experience in the world. And then for those that didn't know me, by extension now, I was a racist. So when I listen to you use this allegory of St. George the Dragon Slayer, it's a little bit predicated upon the idea that there are no more dragons. Are you saying what I was accused of, that really we no longer in America are a victim of racism?
As far as systemic racism goes, and this is something I get accused of a lot, that I'm saying that racism doesn't exist. And that's not what I'm saying at all. Clearly, racism still exists. There are people out there who have racist ideas and racist behavior, and that will always exist. Those people will always, if racism disappeared overnight, people would, start hating each other for the shape of their earlobes. That as long as we are here, hate will persist. But the issue at hand is that racism is the explanation for all racial disparities or all negative events that happen to non-white people, or that it's what critical race theory teaches, that it's infused into our very social structure, that it's the normal operation of society, because that's what critical race theory really pushes, that racism is endemic and that it's woven into the fabric of our institutions to the point of invisibility. So you and I sitting here and talking, Will, it would be seen as having a discussion through the lens of white supremacy, through the system of white supremacy, because it's the normal operation of society and the normal way that things operate. And it's actually comes from a concept from Antonio Gramsci called cultural hegemony, which it basically means that the people in power, that the people who have the elite status, who can pull the strings, create this status quo in society so that people don't even realize that they're being oppressed, that they're being marginalized, because they just assume that everything that's happening is just the normal operation of things. This is life. This is the way that things are. And that's really the attitude that comes with these things. So when George Floyd died, when that whole thing happened, there was no indication, there was no evidence whatsoever that any of that had anything to do with race. I mean, obviously it was upsetting. Obviously it was an emotional thing, but there was no evidence whatsoever that had anything to do with race, except if you buy into this idea of cultural hegemony and that everything that happens to white people, everything that happens to non-white people is filtered through this system of white supremacy. So nothing negative can happen to me without it being racist because I live in a white supremacist system. So people see it that way. So when I'm criticizing this stuff, I'm criticizing that. I'm criticizing that radical collectivization of racism, saying then extrapolating it to the entire system rather than individual events, because those individual events will always exist. And yes, we should speak out against those when there's evidence and it's clear. Obviously, we should push back against that stuff. But to say that it's indicative of a larger systemic problem, it's not true.
So, and you talk about it in your book, Leonidas, you talk about personal experiences of your own with individual racism. I'm curious, do you think, I see so much now, and this was stuff that started with America's quote unquote racial awakening in the wake of George Floyd. I see these, I don't even know how to describe them. I'm not sure what adjective I would use to describe these. I don't know if trite is the word. I'm obviously employing a value on it in choosing to attach an adjective. So let me rewind it and just say, then what do you make, for example, of the NFL allowing players to put "end racism" on their helmets? Or you can see it in the back of end zones. Or if you watch soccer in Europe, you'll often see sort of these blanket statements, but it comes down to, in essence, end racism. If you and I sit here and we do agree that racism is at its core an individual sin, do you think those types of public displays are useful in reducing the individual sin of racism?
No, not at all. Because I think that the motivation is wrong. I think that because when they talk about end racism, they're not talking about let's stop individual racism. They're talking about the more systemic issues that supposedly exist behind the scenes. And we're supposed to embrace this idea that, the police are racist as an institution. Law enforcement is racist as an institution. Public schools are racist as an institution. We're supposed to accept these ridiculous narratives and, push back against the idea that Black people as a whole are not oppressed in society, which is something that I advocate for on a regular basis, and I get attacked for saying that I'm not oppressed. I'm not an oppressed person. But if we're going to buy into what these corporations are saying when they talk about end racism, or they put the black fist in their Twitter profile or whatever, then we're saying that we agree that Black people are oppressed, that white people have privilege that they need to atone for, and that this whole dichotomy of victim and oppressor is accurate. And that we have to separate each other into proletariat and bourgeoisie. And that's what the message is. And it's a divisive message, clearly. And it's just not, it's not accurate. Because while racism exists, it's not the problem that it's made out to be. It's, the individual sins, like you said, they exist, but they're few and far between, and they're just not, they're not the impactful issue that they're made out to be.
Yeah, and you talk about in your book this rhetorical trick of the Mott and Bailey, that what people do is they advance outlandish statements, controversial, indefensible statements. That's the Bailey, the indefensible part of a fortress, essentially. And then when attacked, they retreat to the Mott. They retreat to the castle, the fortress, the more defensible position. But what I find, and I don't know if that works with that rhetorical trick, when people push forward with stuff that on the surface seems benign and universally acceptable, end racism, it's a bit of a Trojan horse. It's a statement that everyone, of course, would agree with. End racism. But by submitting to that public display, you are probably, unknowingly signing up for what you're describing, this entire set of ideas and policies and philosophical acceptances of the world that require you to say, and here's all the systemic things we're going to do, including equity and neo-racism in my mind, to end racism. So it's the Trojan horse of accept this really benign platitude that of course you agree with, and then of course you got to sign up for everything else that's hidden within.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing because most people want to be seen as virtuous. Most people want to be seen as a good person and moral and compassionate and that sort of thing. And you're absolutely right. Like when somebody says end racism, people are like, yeah, of course, end racism. I can get on board with that. But once you recognize what the Motte and Bailey is, you see that it's used everywhere. This idea of pushing this argument that most people would agree with as a front for the more radical nonsense. And an example I like to use is Black Lives Matter. That's probably the most the most egregious example because they push neo-Marxism, they push getting rid of the nuclear family, the riots, the Summer of Love, the idea that all white people are racist, reparations. I mean, there are all these radical ideas underlying Black Lives Matter, but for the normal everyday person, they're going to, that doesn't support that stuff. They'll still say that, yeah, of course I agree with Black Lives Matter. I'll put a Black Lives Matter logo in my profile because that's something I agree with. So it's one way that people are easily manipulated if they're not entirely knowledgeable about the underlying essence of the ideology. And I think critical race theory does that a lot too, because you'll get a lot of, we just want to teach history. We just want to teach kids history. You don't want that? Of course I want to teach kids history. What I don't want is kids being told they need to deconstruct their whiteness in classes, or you need to get rid of the honor roll or get rid of advanced classes because there's not enough Black and brown kids in the classes, and you have this bigotry of low expectations, and all the underlying nonsense that exists in this ideology. So you see it happen frequently, and I think the end racism stuff is just, it's part of it is a virtue signaling ploy, and then the other part, it hides the more radical elements of the ideology. Absolutely.
Oh, so, okay, let's pick up on virtue signaling then. I want to talk about the role of white people. But before I do, I want you to explain to me, in the book you talk about the concept of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Mm-hmm. So I want you to talk about that. Explain to us because I don't want to take for granted that everyone knows what Munchausen syndrome is. Tell me what that is and how it plays into our racial dynamics.
So the book is called Raising Victims, and a lot of it is focused on the impact critical race theory and race-centric ideology has on children and the next generation. And I make an analogy to Munchausen's by proxy, which is a psychological disorder where somebody, typically a caregiver, somebody that's in power over an individual, treats that other individual as if they are sick, as if something is wrong with them in order to garner attention or whatever. And the particular example I used in the book was a woman who her mother would even give her the wrong medication or give her medication she wasn't prescribed, make her eat matches, crazy stuff in order to make her sick. And she didn't even realize it until she had gotten older. And it's that same kind of twisted ideology that we see being fed to children, because we're taking these race-centric, racialized ideas and feeding them into children's minds, this victimhood mentality, this sense of learned helplessness. The idea that white people have this unique sense of evil that is racism, and has history. The entire history of racism falls at their feet, and they must atone for it. All these things are being fed to children, and they're being told, yes, you are sick, and yes, the society is sick. And it's not unlike Munchausen's, because it's feeding those toxic ideas to children, and they're just false. They're just not true. And then it's creating a sickness in children. It's creating it's feeding mental illness into the next generation. And so it's in a lot of ways exactly the same.
Yeah, and in that way, it's not limited to race. I mean, I think you and I talked about this in the past, just exactly how debilitating victimhood is for the person that buys into the ideology, and everyone buys into it in modern America, black, white, male, female, young and old. It seems that everybody now, and it's because we respond to incentive, and everybody has seen the incentive power structure of victimhood. But it still eats the soul. It still debilitates the individual. And I think we talked about this. Like, there's never been a football coach or a sports coach in history that's gone out there and said, listen, here's the deal, boys. The game is rigged. The refs are against you. Everyone is going to ensure that you lose. This is going to be horrific. I'm sorry we put you in this position. Now go get them and succeed. You know, it's just not, it hasn't worked that way. But we are totally debilitating, you know, not just black children, but really, I think, an entire generation to see that victimhood is somehow a source of power.
Yeah, well, the idea of collective guilt is just as debilitating. If you're teaching white children that they're guilty, that they have to pay some kind of penalty for things that somebody else did just because they share a similar skin color, that's just as debilitating as teaching children that they have some kind of shared victimhood just because they share a similar skin color with somebody else who happen to be victimized. I mean, you're teaching children that the world is entirely oppressive, and it's split. It's again, it comes back to that Marxist ideology of proletariat bourgeoisie, that it's split into this dichotomy of victims and oppressors. And honestly, like you said, it's not entirely restricted to race, but we see it with gender and sexuality. We see it across the board, and a lot of times you see kids retreat into these alternate identities. And there's a lot of theory around that suggests that maybe, like, the kids that believe that they're transgender or whatever it may be are seeking ways to basically atone for their privilege or their perceived privilege. So when white children believe that they're transgender, they're looking for ways to they buy into the victimhood, buy into, it's like, I'm not an oppressor. I'm over here with the victims. See, look at me. So if we're split down the middle, we have oppressors and victims. People need to figure out how to get out of that oppressor category. And like you said, there's incentives to do that. So yeah, I think it's oppressive on both sides. But yeah.
So I said I want to talk about the role of white people. And so I love, again, the analogy of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, because I think it fits not just the victim in the scenario, meaning the children who you're teaching victimhood, but which is the sickness that is being taught and therefore keeping the patient sick. But it's actually interesting in that it works for the role of white guilt as well, of the role of the white person, because it really does cast them. It illustrates how they have cast themselves in the role of the caregiver. They've cast themselves in the role of the parent, you know, in that, you know, you're right, you've been oppressed, and it's only through us that you will then, and there's some guys, there's different schools of black thought in essence of philosophy about how to bring the black population up to a greater standard of independence and not dependent upon white people. And there's some that are say, I don't need your deliverance, right? And I don't know, this might be Boyce Watkins or others, but I don't need your you to lift me up. I don't need your guilt. I don't need this. But I just find the role of white people within this dynamic so fascinating as well, because they're casting themselves once again as the savior.
Yeah, well, it's a particular type of person that does that, and it comes from the progressive ideology, this white saviorism, and yeah, I always make the point that, you know, you have to believe in a sense of white supremacy to believe that you're in a position to save me just based on our skin color differences. So you believe that somehow, just because
Yes.
that you're a white person, that you have this magical status and magical privilege that you can reach down and lift me up and help me because you have this stance of supremacy. You have to believe in a sense of white supremacy in order to propagate that ideology. But of course, they don't see it that way. They see themselves as virtuous and as compassionate, because anything you do in progressivism is compassion, and anything outside of progressivism is lacks compassion, and that's just the way that's the way that they see it.
And Leonidas, it reminds me, by the way, of all of these instances where, something is said, I guess that could be debatable. The one that always comes to mind on this is, I can't remember his name, but the tennis broadcaster who was broadcasting, I think it was Venus Williams match, not a Serena Williams match. And he said something like she's using guerrilla tactics, right? And then everybody said, oh my God, what a racist. But what's fascinating about that, those that immediately leap to the conclusion, the certainty that it's racist, had to have their minds geared in such a way to only think of the term as guerrilla tactics as applied through a racial lens. And I see this and I do have progressive friends who are always like, that sounds racist. I'm like, why does that sound racist to you? Like, where's your mind geared that it's always as though this word, which truthfully, we could cut it one way or the other, and we need some context, your context is always the worst.
Yeah, like the fact that they jump to those conclusions immediately, it's suspicious. And I remember there was an example. I don't remember what company it was, but they had a T-shirt with a monkey on it, and I don't even remember what the caption was. Monkey, I'm a monkey, or I'm a crazy monkey, monkeying around. That's something like that. And it was a little brown skinned kid in the ad that was wearing the T-shirt, and people lost their minds because they obviously been comparing a monkey with a black person. It's extremely racist, but that's where their minds immediately went. Whereas, they didn't think that, oh, yeah, crazy kids acting crazy. We call them monkeys. I call my kids monkeys all the time, where they jumping on furniture and stuff. I can't think of a parent in this country who hasn't referred to kids as monkeys at one time or another. But that's not where it went. It went immediately to race. And so, yeah, it's questionable.
Yeah.
Like, why? But now it could just be. I'll give a little bit of, I guess, a little bit of grace to that and say that, but it's still a little cynical. But it could just be that they recognize that it could be seen in a certain way, and they want to immediately get their virtue out there, immediately show that, I am not racist. I see the potential for racism here. Look how virtuous I am. Because like we talked about earlier, there's a lot of incentive for that, and there's a lot of positive reinforcement for that kind of behavior. And so it could just be that sense of looking for outrage and looking for opportunities to show how virtuous you are. But still, the fact that their minds go there immediately, it's suspicious.
Looking for dragons, always looking for another dragon to slay, to confirm their identity. So I want to ask you about this. So, in the great scheme, you talk about in the book, and I think a lot of us have had this conversation now, and I hope that most people listening understand the difference between equality and equity, that they sound the same, but they are very different. What do you think, Leonidas, is the goal in the end? And when I'm a little hesitant sometimes to say, what is the goal of critical race theory? Because it almost feels too limiting. I feel like there's something more going on here than just critical race theory. And I don't think it's even just critical theory, meaning the extension to critical queer theory or whatever it may be, critical theories at large, where we divide people based upon identity. But what is the goal? It clearly isn't equality. It's not get us all to a place where we see each other as individuals and we have an equal opportunity. There's some other end state, some other vision of utopia. What is it?
Cultural revolution. That's the goal. The goal, and it's not limited to race. And we see the same behaviors coming from the queer theory, gender theory, it's the same playbook, and it all comes from the Marx roots, the communist roots. And I know that, and I feel like that's been so overplayed that people kind of shut off when they hear Marxism or they hear communism, because it it seems like conspiracy theory. It seems like, oh, you're just being conspiracy theorist. Like you're just oh, Marxism. You don't even know what Marxism is. But if you follow the roots of this stuff, it all goes back to Marx. And the founders of critical race theory called themselves Marxists. The founders of Black Lives Matter called themselves Marxists. They worshipped Mao. So the ideology itself comes directly from Marxist roots. And if we follow that to the logical conclusion, it's what happened in China under Mao. It's a cultural revolution. And Mao said, he was quoted as saying that in order to build a new society, which he meant a communist society, the old site must be swept clean. So he wanted to get rid of the old histories, the old traditions, the old ideas, and completely build a new society from the ground up, that where all that old stuff was wiped out. And that's what we're seeing in our country. That's what we're seeing with these different ideologies, that they're trying to manipulate and destroy our entire institutions, and build this new utopia from the ground up. And the critical race theory, the founders, they say explicitly that they distrust the Enlightenment rationalism, the Western ideals of liberty and rights and neutral principles of constitutional law. The things that we think are non-controversial, they say, no, 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 those are evil and they only perpetuate white supremacy and they must be dismantled. So the logical conclusion is that everything must be torn down and destroyed, and all we know, everything that we know to be true now needs to be flipped on its head and rebuilt in this racially equal communist utopia. And that's what they want, even if they don't say it explicitly.
You're 100% right, by the way. Whenever you invoke Marxism or you honestly do a deep dive into the history, it comes off as conspiratorial, even though it is 100% accurate. That is the philosophical foundation of all critical theory. It is Marxist. Yep. But you just said also along the lines, it's supposed to create some type of revolutionary racial utopia. You have a line in the book where you talked about that revolution, though, begins to look a lot like revenge. And I think that many people have kind of come to this observation that we're really clearly not interested in establishing racial equality and equity. You point this out in the book. I think this is fascinating. You talk about equity isn't a way of bringing everybody up to an equal standard, but rather tearing down people to some sense of an equal outcome. And so I'm curious, describe for me what you mean. And this, again, is what I think people have observationally experienced, or at least kind of perceived. The goal seems to be up in the hierarchy. Okay, yes, in history, white people, in American history, white people enslaved black people. The goal doesn't seem to be to get us to an equal footing now, but actually to up in that hierarchy and exact some sort of revenge.
I agree with that. Yeah. And when you talk about equity, the only way equity can succeed is by equalizing at the bottom. It's never about lifting people up. It's always about looking at who's ahead and then, tearing them down in some fashion. That's why we don't look at these kids in school are struggling a little bit in math class, so maybe we should give them extra tutoring or help them study or whatever. Like, no, we're just going to get rid of advanced math classes, or we're going to reframe math in a racial lens so that it's more culturally sensitive or something ridiculous like that, which is not, I'm not making that up. That's a real thing. And so these ideas of equity are just, they're nonsensical, and they're the complete opposite of equality. Because we talk about equality, equality is treating everybody equally, whereas equity is intentionally treating people unequally in order to try to achieve equal results, which is not possible. It's that egalitarian ideology is not possible. Now, as far as revenge goes, and this idea of vengeance, which I talk about pretty frequently, that racial justice is this ideology that tends to seek out retribution for past sins rather than our understanding of justice, in the idea of equal treatment under the law and fairness and those sort of things, or that the idea that justice is blind and not going to consider race or gender or anything like that in making determinations. But racial justice is intentional about seeking retribution against white people. So I think there was a lot of truth to the idea that the ultimate goal is to upend the hierarchy or the perceived hierarchy. Um, and when I say that they want to create this racially equal communist utopia, that's a little bit tongue in cheek, because anytime somebody says that they want to create a communist utopia, uh, there's never going to end up that way, and it's always going to end up with somebody at the top exploiting people at the bottom, and then everybody ends up on the bottom eventually, and leaves behind mass destruction and death. So it's the stated purpose, the stated goals of the ideology don't fit what the underlying goals are, and I think that's true. But I think that as
In
far as
fact,
vengeance goes, I think there's a lot of animosity and a lot of resentment that goes into it.
you say something interesting in the book. We're distinguishing equity from equality, and it's an
Mhm.
important distinction. But if people understand the differences, then there's still, I think, appropriately, probably 100% approval rating for the idea of equality. But you quote Milton Friedman in here, and you talk about that equality and freedom are inherently incompatible. Explain to me the tension between equality and freedom.
Well, it's the pursuit of equality. So, it's the idea of equality in outcomes, because we all have different abilities. We all make different choices. We all have different backgrounds and different things. And you put two people together. I quote Thomas Sowell all the time that the same person's not even equal to himself on different days. And so it's impossible to have equality. It's impossible to have equality of outcomes when there's so many variables that drive disparities between individuals, let alone between groups. So the only way to try to achieve equality, and this was what Milton Friedman was getting at, is that you would have to do it through force, and you would have to do it through limiting freedom. And the short story Harrison Bergeron comes to mind, where in order to create an equal society, uh, people had to be handicapped, and people of greater ability had to be handicapped. Ballerinas had to wear weights, and people with pleasant voices had to speak harshly, and things like that. And it has to be that way. It requires a restriction on freedom in order to attempt to create equality. And even then you don't create equality, because it's not a possible, it's impossible. You can't do it. But Milton Friedman said that liberty, like the more liberty you have, the more equality you have. And it's but the less liberty you have, the less equality. And it's kind of counterintuitive for people, because they think that they have to kind of force the hand. They have to kind of make this happen, or else it won't happen. Whereas, the more freedom that you give people, and the more equal things tend to be. It's not going to be perfect. Nothing's ever going to be perfect. There's no utopia, but the more freedom, the better. So
Hey, I want to jump ahead now to sort of your conclusion in the book. And again, you and I have talked about this in the past. Your conclusion is interesting in that many of us, I think myself included, have rejected the sort of kumbaya platitude of colorblindness, because the idea of colorblindness seems to suggest there's some ability to not see color. And the idea is to not walk through the world with blinders, but to walk through the world with open eyes and to see deeper, to see, and this is something that you adhere to as well, to see people for who they are, their character, their individuality, and to see skin color as just another characteristic like eye color or hair color. You talk about that as the ultimate goal. How do we, so I want to talk about, like, obviously I believe that's an accomplishable goal on an individual basis, Leonidas. But then I also come back to this idea that human beings are inherently tribalistic. It's a survival tool of humans throughout humanity. And, I've read, there's a study famously, I think it was done, where if you took a young black kid and a young white kid and you put them in front of a television and they've never even really been preached to about race, and they watch two basketball teams play each other and one's primarily black and one's primarily white, they will gravitate toward and root for the team that mostly resembles themselves. And, in some respects, Leonidas, my personal experience in life without, how much detail, gives some validation to that sort of social experiment. For a long time, I lived in New York City, and my kids went to a very diverse school, not in the modern sense of the word diversity, where it has no meaning, but truly diverse, racially diverse, and socioeconomically diverse. But as they gravitated, one of my sons actually ended up in a school where it wasn't diverse. It was like 90% black. And my sons played soccer with kids where they were absolutely the minority, right? And they were friends since friends since really young on the same teams with these kids. And to this day, I will say they are lifelong friends. But I will tell you something that I noticed. There is self-segregation, right? If they all went to the playground together when they were young, maybe not when they were 3, 5 years old, whatever it may be. But maybe by the time they're 9, 10, 11 years old, you would see, the teammates who are black who have known the white teammates their whole life are gravitating towards whatever it may be, this over here and hanging out together. And then the 4 or 5 non-black players are over here. And again, they're friends. There is no rejection going on. There's no racism truly being employed, but there is some element of self-segregation taking place. How do we I share your goal, your vision of the world, and it's one that I aspire to live by and like to think that I accomplish, to see each other as individuals. How do we take that and reconcile it with the fact there is some human nature towards tribalism?
Yeah, well, the first thing I would say is that the idea of color blindness is more of a metaphor than something that's to be taken literally. And there's a lot of criticism around that. That's how could you say that you're colorblind? Clearly, you see color. It's like, obviously, like that's not what I'm saying. I think it was Coleman Hughes that used the analogy of being warm-hearted or cold-hearted, and like, not what we mean literally. It's a metaphor, and it's not to be taken literally. But it is meant to, like we said, to see people as individuals and not treat color as something that is a defining characteristic of who we are as a person. But it is still part of who we are, and that should be acknowledged. And I don't think that I shy away from that. I think about stories, like we get away from the racial element. I think about stories of little girls who see a Disney princess that has the same color hair as they do, and they have a closer identification with that Disney princess just because they have the same color hair. And I think kids do that to some extent, and I think it's kind of a human nature thing. I think you're right about the tribalistic tendencies, and I don't really have a problem with that. I think that people should have the freedom to associate with who they want to associate with, and live freely. But the problem comes where we start making judgments. We start making value judgments about each other based on race. And I think that if a society existed, even if people self-segregated to an extent, um, but we saw each other as individuals still, and we didn't treat race as consequential to our identity, then I think that's the kind of society I would want to live in. I would have no problem with that at all. Uh, because again, free, people have the freedom to do what they want to do, and uh, you can live in whatever kind of neighborhood you want to. You can associate with other kind of people you want to. Um, but the underlying essence is that we're all individuals, we're all humans, we're all Americans, and we all share this country together, and we move forward together as one people. And I think we do that a little bit anyway. Like I hang out with theater people. I do a lot of theater, and I hang out with theater people. So you gravitate toward certain people who you feel comfortable with, or you feel like you share interests with, or you share a culture with, or whatever it may be. But I'm not going to judge you if you don't like theater. Like I'm not going to make value judgment. Well, maybe I will. Maybe I take that back.
Well, the same way I feel about sports.
You know what I mean.
No, but it works. I think, and it works with what you talked about. Okay, let's just say that and I don't even think it's about judgment. I'm not even worried about judgment. I'm worried about living the most, not virtuous signal life, but the most virtuous life, right? And that one can as an individual. It works if you think of race as a characteristic as you described. If you aspire to treat race the same way you do eye color or hair color or whatever it may be, because race is just one other input in the commonalities that you may have with somebody else, culture being much deeper, right? So you throw me into a room. How about this? Okay. And this is no value judgment on you. If you throw me into a room with a bunch of white dudes who are into theater and a bunch of black dudes who are into sports, I'm going to have more commonalities with the black dudes that are into sports, right? We're going to gravitate to each other, and we're going to have the same conversations. So race is just one more input on how we self-select each other in terms of our commonalities.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. But I think once you start seeing people as individuals and you start de-emphasizing racial elements, then you start to see more division lines between people. So that
Yes.
just because I and some guy in New York have somewhat similar skin tones, you have no real reason to group us together. Uh, Immediately, unless we have other things in common that are apparent. So, but you start to see it starts to more individualize people, because the same thing. Like I don't think all brunette people are the same. Like I don't group them all together because they all have
Right.
brown hair. Like like it makes no sense to do that. But you see the commonalities, but you still look at that person as an individual, and you see the full person and all the variety of traits that make them who they are. And their hair color is just one of them, one of many, like you said. And yeah, I think that moving toward a world where skin color is treated that way is desirable. And that's absolutely what we should be doing. That is, instead of critical race theory, to solve the individual sin of racism, that's always going to exist, but to at least move toward a world where it's better. I think that's the way that we do it. Rather than hyper-emphasizing race, we de-emphasize it.
Yeah, and I like how you said you begin to see complexities, because then you start to see, okay, let's just stick with the analogy. A bunch of white guys are into theater, a bunch of black guys that are into sports, but the longer you spend and the more you try to see past simplicities, don't reinforce simplicities, then you begin to see all of the complexities of the lines within. And, who knows who you come out of that room with as your best friend, right? Who knows once you get to know
Right.
deeper and deeper layers. And then you point out, like, race in and of itself, like that is so complex, right? Like, I don't even know how we do it. Like black, white, you point out all the mixed race involved in your family, your wife, your own, your children. Like, how do you do it? How do we draw these simplistic lines?
Right. Yeah. It ultimately makes no sense because, like you said, my own history, like I have German, I have Native American, I obviously African. I have all of these different things in my family lineage. So what do I identify with? What do I latch onto? And I always make the joke that at this point we're all mutts. We're all mixed with a variety of ancestries, and so it really makes no sense to latch on to any one of those things and make that the crux of our identity, or to make the crux of somebody else's identity. It doesn't make any sense to do that.
Right.
So, even researchers will say that, race is not, it's a social construct. It's not a real thing. It's not something you can actually take and draw lines because there's too much overlap and there's too much, there's too much mixed together that, there's no way to actually delineate it and say that you're definitely this race and you're definitely that race. I mean, there's commonalities, there's somewhat common ancestries where people tend to have common features, kind of phenotypical features. But as far as genetics go, man, we are all pretty much the same. Like the difference between you and I genetically is minuscule. It's barely even worth mentioning. So, like I said, it's got to be one of those things where we see each other as just another human being, and I guess not judge each other for sports and theater.
Well, what I like about the aspiration to see each other as individuals is we always cast it through the light of positivity. But I mean, I think actually the light of negativity is one of the better ways to see it. Like, in other words, you go through the world, right, and you think that you're always the victim of racism. It could turn out you're just an asshole. And nobody likes your personality, your individual personality. Right. Or in reverse, maybe you are an asshole, or everyone around you was, or maybe that guy you were interacting with was an asshole, right? Maybe it isn't because he's racist. It's because he's an asshole. So you've just robbed everybody of their personality types, including their negativity.
That's very true. And there's a saying that if you go through your whole day and everybody's a jerk to you, maybe you're a jerk. Maybe you're the jerk. Maybe it's you. And yeah, I've made the point before that there seems to be this sense that nothing negative can ever happen to a Black person without it being considered racism. And yeah, sometimes it's just that people, well, I say a lot of times, it's just that people are just jerks. People just, they're just being a D-bag for whatever reason. And but because that happened to me, and I happen to have brown skin, oh, that must be racism. This person right. Yelled at me. Oh, racism. This person made fun of me. It's racism. So yeah, it was the Venus Williams thing. They're clearly racism. It's not a slip of the tongue. It's not just lack of articulation or just a misspeak. It has to be racism, Will. So yeah, it's definitely
maybe.
But it makes you lose
maybe you just ran into a jerk. Maybe you ran into a jerk, not a racist.
Possibly.
Okay, last thing, and this is going to tie us back to where we came from the beginning, and it's going to be a little bit of a, but I think you are going to be able to handle this question without it having to be the brunt, the entirety of your book. But, we talked about the rejection of the concept of racism, and you do not. You acknowledge the existence, as do I, of racism as an individual sin. But you did wholly reject the concept of racism as systemic. I believe earlier in our conversation, you did give a definitive answer to that. Now, somebody you named in your book as essentially a racial grifter, somebody who has a vested interest in perpetuating this, for example, is Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's written a lot on redlining, legal, and you and I both know critical race theory isn't limited to law, but they essentially talk about the dominoes falling of at one time systemic racism. It wasn't always just an individual sin. I think we can agree, like when slavery was legal, That was a systemic problem in addition to an individual problem. And they take from that then essentially a set of dominoes that fall, right? Jim Crow laws and on down to the point at which you arrive at a place where someone has trouble getting a bank loan or whatever it may be, and you can trace it back to systemic laws that were once in place. And someone then being the product or the victim of that environment over decades. What do you say to that argument as evidence of systemic racism?
So the point I make is, I guess it depends on how you define systemic racism, which the way that it's defined in much of progressivism and in critical race theory is that racism is inherent in the institution itself. And that is independent of the people who exist within that system. So you have a law that's passed, or you have a particular institution that, like a bank, and the outcomes, the disparate outcomes that occur within that system are indicative of systemic racism. That's the basic argument that's being made. My argument is that systems cannot operate on their own without input from individuals. So even during Jim Crow, and I make this case in the book, like there were people who defied Jim Crow laws and did not segregate, which is evidence that Jim Crow laws could not operate by themselves. So the systemic racism that you would call a Jim Crow law could not segregate, could not engage in racism or disparate outcomes by themselves. They required individuals to do that. And so I don't think that a system, so that you have a bank that if a bank redlines a certain neighborhood or denies loans to a certain race of people, that is still an individual sin. And it's still individuals operating because, they're not doing that, blindly. They're not doing that without any knowledge that what they're doing is discriminatory. So you have to have evidence that people are doing that. And there's not a lot of evidence that they were doing that specifically for race, particularly when you have banks that were redlining the same, black-owned banks that were redlining the same neighborhoods. And you have white-owned banks that were giving loans to Asian Americans at a higher rate than white Americans. So the question that would need to be asked is, were these banks also discriminating against their white customers? Were black-owned banks discriminating against their black customers? So anytime there's a racial disparity, and I'm not saying that stuff never happened. I'm not saying that none of it was ever discriminatory or racially based, or that there's no effects from history that from before. But if you're going to make a claim that somebody's current circumstances are a direct result of systemic racism, you have to have direct evidence that people were engaging in racism, and then that the outcomes are a direct result of that. And it just doesn't happen. Like we're supposed to make the logical leap that, okay, because slavery existed and because Jim Crow existed, because redlining existed, that now these people in these neighborhoods cannot escape their circumstances. And there is so many more variables to consider and so much more to talk about that just doesn't get discussed. So the idea, I just don't buy into it. Like currently, there is no law on the books that is discriminatory on the basis of race. Well, I take that back, because there are laws that discriminate against white people, but there are no laws that discriminate against black people. And the idea that these systems can operate clandestinely and create these racial disparities is just not, it doesn't track. The other thing Ta-Nehisi, and I'll try not to be long-winded here, but the other thing Ta-Nehisi Coates needs to address is the massive disparities that exist within the group of Black Americans. why is there so much disparity? Like Black Americans who adhere to a different culture and different cultural behaviors, different attitudes toward toward success. Why do they tend to have such more positive outcomes than this other group of Black Americans when they're supposedly faced with the same racial difficulties? And those questions don't really get addressed, other than, well, it's just white supremacy, and those Black Americans are adhering to white normative behavior, and therefore they're able to benefit from white privilege, which is just absolutely absurd. So yeah, I don't buy into it. There's not enough evidence.
Well, that is a very complicated subject, and I'm apologetic for cracking open that can at the end of our conversation. But you said a couple of things that I think resonate with me, and that is, anyone's situation in life is multifactorial. There are so many variables that go into any particular group or individual's situation in life, and it's hard to unravel. But what is complicating that factor is if you go down the path of, well, there are racial disparities attributable to historical patterns or laws or racism, then what's been made clear by the movement for reparations or for critical race theory is that the goals are nothing short of revolutionary. So it's not as though you can unwind this ball of yarn, 20, 30 years, I don't know, and make it repair racial inequities when the stated goal of almost every, BLM type organization or critical race theory adopted organization is 100% revolutionary. To your point, the entire system is white supremacist. So you have to go back to the nation's founding, its documents, its institutions, its founding fathers, and restructure and reorder it all, which takes you back to, well, then what is your goal here? It doesn't seem to be to lift up from these historical inequities to a place of equality. It seems to be revolutionary, revenge-filled, and utopic.
It has to be that. Yeah, it has to be this idea that, if you believe those things, if you believe that the foundation of our country goes back to 1619 and when first slaves were brought to the shores of America, and that the entire country was built on slavery and racism, and all of our founding principles were built on racism and white supremacy. And if you believe that, then the only solution is to tear everything down and start over. There's no repairing that. If racism is woven into the fabric of our society and it's imbibed into our institutions, then it can't be teased out. Like, it can't be reformed, and it has to be torn down. And that just happens to be the goals of Marxist revolution, of the cultural revolution.
Right.
And so they don't state that specifically. They don't state it explicitly that that's what they want to do, but it would have to be that. It would have to be. But one other point I want to make too is that about the effects of history on the present. You think about if let's say something terrible happened to your grandmother, and it completely altered the course of her life. And, she ended up in poverty or whatever it may be. Like, it was a horrible thing happened to your grandma. Then your mother comes along, and she has this whole life where she's making choices and she's making decisions, and, she has these attitudes, and she builds her culture, and she does different things. And then she has you, and then you grow. And you have your environment, and you make choices, and you decide who you are, and so, like, by the time it gets to a certain point in your life, say your mid-20s, then you can't even calculate the number of decisions and choices that have led you to that point where you are without even looking at what happened to your grandmother, without even talking about it. So the idea that you can draw a straight line from what happened to your grandmother to your current circumstances at 25 is ridiculous without considering all of the myriad of choices that not only you made, but that your mother made and that your grandmother made, and everything that happened in between. So it's it's very simplistic and myopic, and to say, I mean, that's just your grandmother, but to draw it back to even slavery and say, yeah, because slavery happened, this is why I'm in my circumstances today. It's insane.
And disempowering.
It's absolute madness to make
and disempowering to the point of the book, Raising Victims. So listen, first of all, I would love to have a conversation in the future. I hope you'll come back. I'd love to have a conversation about intra-group disparities, how you alluded to that, and cultural disparities within Black America. I think that's a fascinating conversation in and of itself that deserves its own time. I hope you'll come back for that. I love the way you end the book. It's a place that I'm certainly gravitating towards in life as well, that it's impossible to arrive at a place of, I don't know if the word is, I don't know, Leonidas, if the right word is virtue or enlightenment, but you just can't arrive at an independent personal space that is healthy really without finding yourself in this place wondering about purpose and faith. And you talk about that in there in I think very healthy, mentally healthy ways of living a life of gratitude, and how empowering that becomes. But anyway, I love how you end the book with that. Again, Raising Victims. It's an incredible book. I think everyone should check it out. I hope you'll come back, and I hope you and I can continue these conversations, not on an every 18-month basis, but more often. Thank you, Leonidas.
Absolutely. Thank you, Will. I appreciate you, man.
All right, man. Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.